Good morning, everyone, and welcome back if you've been here before. If you haven't, welcome anyway. And this is going to be the first installment of Jane Austen's Emma, which we will enjoy immensely. However, before we begin that, I thought you all would find this really interesting. There was an article in the June 2022 Smithsonian Magazine. I don't know. I'm sure people out there have this. But there was an article entitled Escape from the Gilded Cage. This is about women at the end of the 1800s. So Emma is set a number of years earlier in approximately 1811 or 1812. But this was about the situation of women at the end of the 1800s, which we do see played out in this book. The book is about marrying, and it's about social decorum. And this article gives us a little bit of insight into the place of women and marriage. This article is discussing the place of women in America. And we know that our book is set in England, but it still does give us a little bit of insight. So I just want to read something from to you. This is called Escape from the Gilded Cage. And um, there's quite a bit of background here, but let me read some of this. It's very interesting. A woman of means traveling alone booked 4 seats across 2 unupholstered benches, an expensive but necessary signal of her propriety. So she is traveling on a train, and she's starting on the East Coast. Um, it is not unusual to see a lady disembark alone in the great central depot in Chicago. But for a few, their destination was still farther west. For this particular woman, there could only be one reason to undertake a 1,500-mile trip. She had come to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, for a divorce. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States had a hodgepodge of state divorce laws. South Carolina had no allowances at all for divorce. New York was only slightly less strict, severing the marriage bond only with proof of adultery. The most permissive divorce laws in the United States existed at the edges of the settled country, where a settler fell under the jurisdiction of local courts after a brief residency. This was a simple acknowledgment of the itinerant nature of pioneer life, but it was also an opportunity for divorce seekers. And again, this is relevant because this represents the difficulty for women. Once they were in a marriage, that was it. These migratory divorces, in quotation marks, inflamed a country already worried about an epidemic of broken marriages. For them, the stakes of the divorce debate were no less than the future of the American family, the very building block of the country itself. On the other side of this battle were those who did not want to fight. They wanted release. Some had endured abuse, infidelity, and desertion. Some were just unhappy and saw for the first time an escape. Um, and we know that American culture was different from British, but for women, there were similarities. There was a place in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, called the Cataract House Hotel. The hospitality at the Cataract House, paired with South Dakota's brief residency requirement in Sioux Falls' 5 railroad lines, made the Cataract the country's headquarters for people seeking divorces. The newspaper called the dwelling of unhappy spouses the divorce colony. In 1893, and again, this is 80 years after where our novel is set. In 1893, South Dakota raised its residency requirement from 90 days to 6 months. But even in the early years of the 20th century, divorce seekers from more restrictive states were willing to spend a half a year at the cataract in exchange for freedom. Um, Women who traveled to Sioux Falls at the turn of the 20th century were not activists. For each of them, the decision to end her marriage was a private one. But what might have been quite a quiet act of personal empowerment and self determination became, in the glare of the national spotlight, a radical political act. Though married women had secured the right to own property only a generation earlier, and the right to vote was still a distant dream, that was in 1920 in this country. These divorce seekers collectively forced the issue into the national conversation. The women of the divorce colony, mostly wealthy white socialites, were not representative of the legions of unhappy spouses in this country or others. The challenges faced by those without financial resources were more formidable. Their notoriety, these women reshaped the country's attitude toward divorce. In asking for their freedom, the divorced colonists in Sioux Falls were among the first rebels of this revolution. They had, quite unintentionally, set the country down a winding path towards the acceptance and accessibility of divorce. They had rising ideals and a new vision for marriage, and for each of them, divorce was a declaration of independence. So I include this because we have seen in so many novels the situation for women was a dead end. You got into a marriage because you had to. If you were the dreaded spinster, you were stuck. You remained that for the rest of your life. It was a moniker that was not desirable. And while that article was referring to this migration of women from the East Coast to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, can you imagine, on a train? It does present a background for what is going on in our novel. Emma, oh, there's all my little tabs. So let's take a look at these the novel itself. Um, I have my notes. Okay, now I have to go to some historical information. Um, Thank you to Jane, who has provided me with a voluminous amount of information. In my life, I've been doing this for I don't know how long, like 12 years or something. There is more information on Jane Austen and her novels than I've ever seen on any, except maybe Henry James. Um, it's almost overwhelming. I was talking to Jane the other day, and there's so much that I found myself kind of treading water. But let's begin with a little bit of historical information um, about the period. Um, Jane Austen. This is a study guide about Jane Austen's Emma. Jane Austen is both a Georgian, which was the period between 1714 and 1830, and a Regency writer, which was the period between 1811 and 1820, meaning that she lived her life under the reigns of George III and his son George IV. Because he became mentally incompetent, George III stepped down and allowed his son to rule in his place as regent. The extravagant George IV was a patron of the arts and a fan of Austen's work, and she dedicated Emma to him at his strong suggestion. And you'll notice this, it's in the beginning of the book. He really enjoyed the novel, and he's king, so he was able to request that she dedicated the novel to him. It's right before the start of the novel. To His Royal Highness, the Prince Regent, this work is, by His Royal Highness's permission, most respectfully dedicated by His Royal Highness's dutiful and obedient humble servant, the author. He wanted it dedicated to him. She didn't really want to. Okay, so the Georgian era was one of great turmoil and upheaval. Austen was born 1 year before the American Revolution. lived her teen years and beyond through the French Revolution, and toward the end of her life saw Great Britain's defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. The War of 1812 and the first phase of the Industrial Revolution also occurred during her lifetime. And one of the criticisms of Austen's works is that she presents such a narrow field, but we will see as we are going through the novel that she does, in fact, make reference to these larger events that were going on around this small world that belonged to Emma and her little family. Well, it was a big family. The world of Austen's novels seems to exist mostly outside this chaotic realm, which is especially true in Emma. Nonetheless, the author did have some consciousness of the changes going on around here. On the one hand, she upholds the British class structure. So we're gonna watch for that, upholding the British class structure. And on the other, she satirizes. You know how I do this. I finished that and I'm moving on. She satirizes snobbery and slavish devotion to class structure. Austen occupied herself with the role that class and gender played in the day to day life of the middling classes, those between aristocratic nobles, which are the royal family, down through the barons, and the lower classes, craft, agriculture, factory workers, and the poor. The middle class in the Regency period had some fluidity. At the higher end of the middle were baronets and knights, along with the landed gentry, families with property who made their money from agricultural activities on their estates. Depending on how rich a family was, its members would be more or less involved in the day to day management of farming. But if someone in the middling classes was able to make enough money, sorry, Daphne is throwing balls at me, and I'm trying to pretend that she's not, and that's why my camera's jiggling. Um, Even more difficult was the position of women, which is why who were legally treated as children. Jane Austen knew firsthand the financial difficulties of single women of modest means who relied on relatives for their livelihood. She understood the plight of governesses hired out as tutors and quasi nannies, the only respectable work a middle class woman could do. She also observed the dilemmas of women from prosperous families whose entire happiness depended on making a suitable match. And then she was stuck, like the American women. The trials and tribulations of the landed gentry, the upper class, and the socially aspiring lower middle class are the subjects of her comic novels, including Emma. Emma, which was published in 1815, was Austen's fourth novel. She based it on her life in Hampshire and said of it, I am going to take a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. After finishing it, she was afraid readers would not like it as much as they had Pride and Prejudice, which was published in 1813. Both novels today are considered masterpieces of English literature. I have an article here that will discuss in part why it's considered a masterpiece. We all know that Austen has a huge following. I have a friend who traveled to England to follow the path that is supposedly outlined in the novel, the places. Okay. Austen enjoyed some critical acclaim and money for her work, but remained anonymous as an author. After she died at 41 of Addison's disease in 1817, her brother Henry revealed her identity and also published her last two novels posthumously. So, I'm sure that some people out there know what Addison's disease is. I I didn't really. I had certainly heard of it. And I, of course, because I'm involved in dogs, I had heard of dogs who had gotten it. But I wanted to know exactly what this is. By the way, Austin's dates are 1775 to 1817. So Addison's disease is a disorder in which the adrenal glands don't produce enough hormones. Specifically, the adrenal glands produce insufficient amounts of the hormone cortisol and sometimes aldosterone too. When the body is under stress, as in fighting an infection, this deficiency of cortisol can result in a life threatening Addisonian crisis characterized by low blood pressure. I did not know that. Symptoms tend to be nonspecific and include fatigue, nausea, darkening of the skin, and dizziness upon standing. Treatment involves taking hormones to replace those not produced by the adrenal glands. So, Addison's was not defined in Austin's time. So, she lived a pretty short life that was cut short by Addison's disease. Um, so let's see, what else do I have in here? Do I have anything else? All right, let me tell you a few things about more about Austin. So if you're ever looking for a really beautiful book about the authors that we study, this was recommended to me by Jean. It's absolutely fabulous. It's writers. I can't read backwards. Writers, Their Lives and Works. It's an absolutely magnificent book. Um, and of course, Austin is in here. And I thought this was something that you all would like to see. Um, Look at this beautiful picture of Austin. Isn't that just really beautiful? That is not the way I really pictured her. I pictured her a little bit more severe, but isn't that pretty? I really enjoyed that. So I'm not sure if you can hear this, but somebody is outside barking, so I'm going to pause and I'll be right back. I always think I'm a genius when I can figure out this video recording. Sure as shooting, I was able to pause it and start it again. So let's go back to Austin. Um, Jane Austen was born in the village of Steventon, Hampshire, the seventh of 8 children. Her father, George, was a rector of a local church. Though he came from a good family and had been educated at Oxford, he lived a life of genteel poverty. George had no land, no tenants, no private income, so to make ends meet, he had to give lessons to the sons of some local gentry. So there's a picture here in this book of his little, it was St. Nicholas Church in Steventon. And I figure out how to aim it at the camera. Where did it go? Oh, there. it's, it's a small country church. It's really quite picturesque. Um, some critics dismiss Austen's novels for their preoccupation with money, rich relatives, and the making of advantageous marriages. But these themes are entirely understandable. And as we will see, there is a subtext that is much more complex than just those themes. Another text that I have says that her novels are concerned with manners, propriety, and marriages. That is pretty, that's really oversimplifying. At a very early age, Jane would have been exceedingly aware of her limited prospects. We have seen that over and over and over in the short stories that we've read, in the novels that we've read. One's prospects were really important to women at the time. And we even going back to that article about escaping the gilded cage, that's what women had to do in order to escape the social requirements. She would have realized that without a dowry, her chances of finding a suitable husband were severely diminished. At the same time, she could also see that there were ways of escaping one's destiny. In around 1783, her brother Edward was adopted by distant relatives. Okay, that's a really interesting story. So, Austen's father had 6 sons, and he had a friend who was childless and remained childless. So, apparently, this was something that people did. He gave this childless couple Edward and let them adopt him. I find that puzzling. But Edward was adopted by distant relatives, the wealthy but childless Knight family. Adoptions of this kind were not unusual at the time. In this single act, Edward's fortunes changed and he gained a new lifestyle and states. To the young Jane, this transformation must have seemed almost magical. So it is not surprising that she later tried to give the heroines of her books similar Cinderella like experiences. Isn't that interesting? Edward went from being living in almost poverty um, to becoming well to do just by this one single adoption. Jane, by all descriptions, had a happy childhood. She was particularly close to her older sister, Cassandra, and was educated with her, first at a boarding school in Oxford and later at the Abbey School in Reading. They went to this boarding school for a short time, and then the tuition became too too difficult. The girls were content there, but the fees proved to be too steep for George Austen. So at the end of 1786, they returned home. The two sisters remained very close, and their correspondence has provided invaluable insights into Jane's views and interests. Unfortunately, though, Cassandra destroyed many of Jane's letters after her death, leaving tantalizing gaps in the structure in the narratives. So Cassandra was highly protective of Jane, and so her intent when she destroyed all of these letters was to protect Jane from prying eyes. Um, so, let's see. After 1786, Jane remained at home with her family, delving into her father's library to round out her literary education. We've seen that many, many times where the young women are not given the benefits of an education, but can utilize the books in a relative's library. And that's exactly what she did. Um, this is an interesting tidbit. James, one of the older brothers, loved organizing theatrical entertainments. And there were, so we have to watch that. References to the theater. Because I have in one place that says that Austen disliked the theater. But we really see in other places that she went to the theater and much enjoyed it. Plus, she participated in these family theatrical productions. So She had a diary, and it says that the final date in the notebook, there were several of these, in 1793. From this point on, Austen seems to have begun working on her novels, starting in 1793, although it would be years before any of them were published. Initially, she favored the epistolary form. It was popular at the time. That is, conveying her stories entirely through exchanges of letters between the principal characters. She also used other documentary forms such as journals or diaries. By the end of the century, however, the epistolary novel was going out of fashion, and this is undoubtedly why Austen decided to abandon the format. In its place, she introduced an entirely new form of narration, which modern critics have dubbed free indirect style or free indirect discourse. We are going to see that in her narration. This was a variant of third person narration, but it is incorporated in the essence of a first person speech. In other words, the narrator could convey the thoughts or speech of the character without the need for such terms as she said or she thought. And I'm betting that in some places you were getting tangled in. Did you just see that? Somebody just came to my door. Isn't that weird? I don't even know what that is. Okay, so Austen used her newly developed technique, this, I, sorry, that, free indirect discourse. Um, She developed this technique of merging narrator and character with immense subtlety in Emma, for example, where the heroine persistently misreads the intentions and affections of her friends. That is what Emma does quite a lot. And in fact, you might have been persuaded that someone's intentions were thus, and then they turned out to be this somewhat later. Austen teases the reader by using the narrator to report Emma's delusions as if they were facts. And we see that over and over and over, which is what is so entertaining about Emma, the character. She's got all of these delusions about what people's intent are and what's good for them. And then she kind of flubs it up occasionally. The reader cannot be sure of the reality of the situation until Emma herself realizes that she is, I'm not telling, that she is in love with somebody. I hate to ruin the story for people, so I'm going to stop with that one. I don't, it, there are other places like in the introduction, especially by the introduction by Ronald Blythe, which I think you all got, um, where we have to stop because you have to be aware that in Blythe, he gives away a lot of the plot. So if you haven't read it yet, stop after the first couple of pages because he's going to give away the whole plot. Let's see. Let's think about the publication of the novel. As a woman, Austen found it difficult to get her work published. In 1797, her father was so enthusiastic about First Impressions, which was Austen's initial version of Pride and Prejudice, that he wrote to the publisher, Thomas Cadell, asking if he would read the manuscript. Cadell declined. Austen herself fared no better. In 1803, she sold Susan, later renamed Northanger Abbey, to the publisher Crosby and Company for £10, which was $45. This was her first major novel, a gentle satire on the contemporary vogue for Gothic horror stories. I read that just because we have just finished a Gothic horror stories in Rebecca. Publisher did nothing with the manuscript, and eventually, in 1816, Austen's brother bought the copyright. The book was not published in her lifetime. So a couple of other points. She lived in this little town where I showed you that rectory. Um, and in 1801, her father retired and moved the family to Bath. Um, Here, Austen experienced an episode that could come straight out of her novels. In December of 1802, Harris Big Wither, the brother of one of Austen's friends, proposed to her. Um, she accepted immediately, but after sleeping on it, she changed her mind. There has been much speculation about her reasons for doing so, but there is no definitive answer. Perhaps she valued her independence too highly to exchange it for financial security. So we see um, Austen making choices that other characters, fictional characters that we've seen in other novels, don't make, because to be the dreaded spinster was something that one didn't do at the time. I'm sure you can hear Daphne. Um, it was here that Jane's writing career finally took off. Sense and Sensibility became her first published novel, winning favorable reviews and selling well. It appeared anonymously, um, the credit being by a lady, which was typical. Just a second. You know how when you yell at a child and tell him or her that if he doesn't behave, he's going to go in the corner? I always tell Daphne, "Do you want to go in the garage?" She's never actually been in the garage, but it's a big threat. I don't know what she thinks it is, but anyway. So it appeared anonymously, Sense and Sensibility did, which was a common practice for female authors at the time, although Austen's identity was certainly an open secret in literary circles. Austen soon gained many admirers, including the writer Sir Walter Scott and the Prince Regent, who requested that she dedicate Emma to him, which we see that she did. She reluctantly did so, and in 1815 she received an invitation to inspect his remarkable library at Carlton House. So, just a little background on her upbringing. It was it was a very narrow field. After um, Let's see, sadly, Austen did not have long to enjoy her successes and accolades. In 1860, she began to suffer from a mysterious illness. Again, at the time it was undefined Addison's. And she died the following year. She was buried at Winchester Cathedral. Um, so, this is a picture of the cottage where she lived. Again, it's just really picturesque. Um, and so she's an interesting character. Um, I'm not kidding. I think Daphne's gonna have to do time in the garage. Shoving these balls at me. Okay, so let's take a look at the introduction by Ronald Blythe. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I'm going to hit the major points. And again, let me remind you that you should put a big spoiler alert on this because he gives away the entire plot, which is fine if you finished the book, but mostly everybody doesn't finish and goes along with me as we go. Here, this is what's going on here. So, in this introduction, the Blythe says that the novel was published in 1816 rather than 1815. Apparently, it was published quietly in 1850 and then on a larger scale in 1816. Um, A century of the happiest love stories, the most fiendishly difficult of detective stories, and a matchless repository of English wit since it emerged from Albemarle Street on that winter morning. So, this is not just a simple novel of manners. There are so many undercurrents in it. There are references to the larger world events, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and even references to slavery, um, because we'll see this. Some of the characters appear to be involved in that trade. Um, Jane Austen. Oh, I already told you that. The real nature of the discipline she employed to make herself great. Um, and perhaps that's why she declined the marriage proposal. Apparently, sometime later, she became smitten with a clergyman who then died before he could ask the question. So she never married. Her literary development might be traced by placing Defoe, Fielding, Richardson, Fanny Burney, and Crabbe before her, although the truth of the matter is that she arrived at the storytelling scene without ancestors and left it without progeny. We are going to see that um, that the development of her narrative voice was unique and brilliant. We will see that, and but you have to look at the material closely. The material from which she created her books only adds to their miracle. She called it Human Nature in the Midland County, and she keeps a straighter face when, in an infamous letter to her niece, she says that 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. And you would think that one couldn't get enough material out of that, but she does. And her character development is highly sophisticated within these narrow confines. To her brother Edward, who was also writing a novel. Remember, this is the one that was adopted out. Can you imagine giving away one of your kids? But I guess that really improved his prospects. She makes the even more celebrated evaluation and analysis of her art. The little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as to produce little effect after much labor. Okay. So that appears, this sentence, the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as to produce little effect after much labor. So what you have to visualize are little pieces of ivory like this, held together perhaps by a string. So you could flip these little bits of ivory. And much is made out of this. So I looked it up. Of course I did. It says this myth is one of those rare ones about Jane Austen that she herself seems not only to have originated, but also to have insisted upon repeatedly. The locus classicus of this myth is Austen's letter to her 18-year-old nephew, James Edward, who was at the time trying to write an ambitious historical novel. So that contradicts a little bit because this says that she was writing to the niece Anna. Many of her letters were written to Anna. She had quite a correspondence to Anna. But I couldn't really figure out who was the recipient of this letter, but in any case, she is indeed, if not exactly a miniaturist, then at least a practitioner of the small scale. Clearly, Austen deliberately decrescendos and delimits, and in doing so, her achievement was, for her time, highly original. Early reviewers agree that Austen's novels are strikingly and wonderfully precise because they are, in some sense, scaled down. So I see this repeatedly, this idea of the little bits of ivory, um, where she delimits what she's going to talk about. So when there are vague references to the American Revolution and the French Revolution, it's there, and she would have been aware of these things, but her subject matter is neatly delimited. These little bits of ivory have tended to play havoc with outsized literary pretensions ever since. Don't talk to me of Monmouth. Show me the exact spot where Louisa Musgrave fell, said Tennyson. It isn't quite a joke. The morality of unborn, unimaginable Bloomsbury is being aired. The belief that the actions which govern individual human relationships are the actions which matter is being stated. So it is a way of looking at motivation. And we see, if you've gotten any way into the novel, you see the machinations by Emma to get people married off. And she doesn't always make good choices. Um, Blythe goes on to say there is a moral tone which defies the dreariness of that expression. Jane Austen can, in fact, get more drama out of morality than most other writers can get from shipwreck, battle, murder, or mayhem. There is balance in the novel, there is serenity, which leaves contentment at the core of the heart, similar to the perfect rightness which one experiences when listening to Mozart. There is an epigrammatic style which is mainly joyful, though occasionally lethal, and there is a sense of richness and profusion. Even in these little ivory tiles, there is profusion. I'm going to have to. Okay, good thing I figured out how to pause. Let's see. Of all great writers, said Virginia Woolf, she is the most difficult to catch in the act of greatness. I really like that because you think on the surface that this is simply a novel of manners. If you look, and we're going to look at this very carefully, there is a profusion of wordplay that's very sophisticated. She must have been very intelligent. Um, let's see. I told you a bit about when they moved to Bath after the father retired, sorry. When she heard the news that it was all settled, she fainted because she was so immersed in the life that they had in this little area in Hampshire. Um, that reassuring wholeness, which is the essence of Emma, her finest achievement, and I've seen that quite a bit too, that this is her finest novel, returned to her immediately after she returned to her beloved Hampshire. So Bath it was about 8 years, and it wasn't exactly, it didn't really, it wasn't conducive to her developing great fiction. Those who see this return as a retreat, I've seen this too, as a retreat to the provincial trap, may like to be reminded of the astonishing novel making material which lay within the bounds of her own experience and that of her family. And that's the essence. Once she was back in Hampshire, the astonishing novel making material which lay within the bounds of her own experience and that of her family. Those are those little ivory tiles. I think I envision the tiles to be like when you get paint chips from Sherwin-Williams and they connect them together and you flip them. And this is the way she envisions her creative process. Um, this says here that it was to her brother's child, Anna, that Jane wrote most of the letters revealing the principles of her own art. I will try to locate those, but so much of it was destroyed by Cassandra, who was trying to protect Jane from the press. I mean, you can imagine what she's trying to protect her from. So here's more references to Edward. There enters upon the scene one of those fairy tale transformations. of social condition which makes any brief glance at this huge gifted family so confusing. I thought it was confusing that they would just allow someone to adopt one of the children. Apparently the family chose Edward. Again, it's confusing. So let's take a look at that one. Oh, I think I like that one. But you can see the logic of it because it did increase his prospects. As Edward's good fortune, that's a spoiler. We're not going to talk about that. It affected his sister's most creative years as a writer, allowing her to settle comfortably in Hampshire. One must take a passing look at what occurred. So I've already explained to you what happened. The family chose Edward. Um, Edward's was a situation quite treacherous with good luck and social melodrama. But when Jane Austen turned to the theme of adoption in Emma, she balanced the pros and cons so marvelously that the reader is deeply moved by the predicament as well as amused by the good fortune. That's what Austen is trying to establish, the pros and cons. And interestingly, she doesn't really she doesn't tell us which side of the argument of adoption she lands. We have to decide. Um, Edward Austen never forgot the delicacy of his situation, and he doubled the role of dutiful son to two sets of parents quite faultlessly. So here's a note about Cassandra, the sister. Jane's adored and inseparable sister is an enigmatic and slightly larger than life figure. It is she who has fairly successfully managed to conceal the personal Jane from the world. But she did that on purpose. Emma, and we move to the novel, Emma is a brilliant comedy about saying yes or no ostensibly to a series of marriages, essentially to the moral tenets which govern society. So that's the point. A brilliant comedy about saying yes or no to a series of marriages, essentially to the moral tenets which govern society. It is really about marriage as an ordeal, which is why I thought that article about escaping the gilded cage was so interesting. My dog's driving me crazy. Good thing I can pause. Okay, so this is all. I have some notes to myself about it being yeah, here's where the spoiler alert comes into effect. So I'm going to stop. So anybody who's reading this Blythe introduction, you probably should stop at the bottom of page 13. After that, he really goes into quite a bit of detail about the character development and about the plot. Um, the last thing that we're going to talk about or witness here is Emma's wit. In fact, is so splendid in itself as to make it a recommendation enough. So pay attention to that. Particularly if, like Jane Austen, one is willing to concede the redemptive quality of all humor. She was the opposite to heartless when she made Elizabeth Bennet say, "Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me. I own and I laugh at them whenever I can." I think that we probably all understand this, that you can't be funny if you're dumb. Emma's wit is a reflection of Jane Austen's wit. I wish we had more of her own writing because we could get a little bit more insight, and the only insight we have is in her novels. Is Emma then to be forgiven so many big faults merely for the amusement she provides? Obviously not. Her liveliness is symptomatic of a caged bird's dissatisfaction. I really liked that. Her liveliness is symptomatic of a caged bird's dissatisfaction. And we're going to see that. What choices does she make? We'll see. Uh, I'm trying to read ahead to make sure that I don't give anything away. By allowing Emma to make a genuine emotional progress from brittle head to tender heart, and by revealing every step of the way Jane Austen was to advance the 18th century novel along the road which led to Henry James and Proust. All the women in Emma are described with unusual psychological insight, and most of them betray degrees of female neuroses. So, Jane Austen, of course, is a woman. She is a woman who has defied defied social convention by refusing to marry. Um, but Emma herself is a masterpiece of feminine understanding of what's going on around her. Although she does make some faulty assumptions and then creates action through those assumptions that are not correct. Okay, yeah, that's a spoiler. We can't do that one. So I don't know how far along you've gotten. It's probably not too far in because I had established that today was going to be background, and we really need to know quite a bit about um, Austen's background because, like the concept of adoption and Edward, these things are brought into the novels, not just this one, but in other ones as well. I have an article here from Jane. Um, it is entitled "How to Misread Jane Austen" by Louis Menard. I believe it's MENA. It's either MENAND, and it was or MENARD. I read it Menard because I like to go to Menards, but I'm not sure that is correct. It was in the New Yorker in October of 2020, and this again gives us some insight. This person goes on to say the novels are not much help in getting. Let's see, I should have started there. Let's see. Oh, there's not much help in the novels in getting insight into Austen herself. Um, there was a memoir published by her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, but it was published 50 years later after Austen died, which is mainly family oral remembrance, in which she is Dear Aunt Jane. I hardly envision Jane Austen as Dear Aunt Jane. Um, she just seems sharper than that. But anyway, so the novels don't give us much insight, this author says. Besides the usual difficulties involved in trying to extract a moral from works of literature, there is the problem of Austen's irony. She is not just representing characters in her novels, she is representing the discursive bubble those characters inhabit. And she almost never steps outside that bubble, the discursive bubble. And an example of that is what we'll see later in the adoption subject. The discourse is the back and forth, the pros and cons, and how there is no answer. Virginia Woolf compared her to Shakespeare. She said, "She flatters and cajoles you with the promise of intimacy, and then, at the last moment, there is the same blankness. Are those Jane Austen's eyes, or is it a glass, or a mirror, or a silver spoon held up in the sun? Always reflecting the discourse, the discursive bubble. I really like that image. So Austen was hardly a bestseller. By the 1820s, her books were often out of print. The critical line on her, even from admirers like Sir Walter Scott, was that she was a miniaturist specializing in an exceedingly narrow sector of British society, the landed gentry. Those are the little ivory tiles, but the discursive bubble is always much larger than that. Everyone agreed that she captured the world with astonishing precision. Not everyone felt it was a world worth capturing. A carefully fenced, highly cultivated garden with neat borders and delicate flowers. By the way, as you are going along, notice the images of fencing and hedges. It does bear paying attention to because it plays out towards the end of the novel. And I'm not telling you how, but it does. Charlotte Bronte described Pride and Prejudice to a friend. I should hardly like to live with her ladies and gentlemen in their elegant but confined houses. And that was a criticism of Emma as well, that it was a very narrow little world. But on the larger scheme of things, it is very precise. And it had this undercurrent of concept, the discursive bubble. Still, beyond that, there were readers who detected an edge, an irony. Virginia Woolf was one. She said, I would rather not find myself in the room alone with her, with Austen. She must have been kind of prickly. Um, D.W. Harding said in 1939 that Austen's books were enjoyed by precisely the sort of people whom she disliked. She is a literary classic of the society which attitudes like hers, held widely enough, would undermine. So people were beginning to notice the edge in her. You could imagine that Virginia Woolf, of course, did because she had an edge to her. In fact, she has such an edge to her that sometimes she's puzzling. Lionel Trilling said in 1955, an agent he called her the agent of terror, meaning that she is merciless in forcing us to confront our moral weaknesses. So, at first, it may appear, and even in your first reading, it may appear like a nice novel of manners, but if you read it a second time, the subtleties begin to make themselves apparent. Today, there are two Austens. This is really interesting. There are two Austens with probably a fair amount of overlap. And this is what I was just talking about. The recreational readers, Austen, readers meaning possessive Austen, and the English professors Austen. And I think that's really true. I told you about this friend of mine who went to England, and some of you may have done the same thing, gone to England and followed the path of the setting of the novels. And that is perhaps in that category of the recreational Austen. But the English professor's Austen, which is what you're going to get, likes the strong women too, and watches the adaptations with a learned and critical eye. We're going to try and be that. But the professor thinks that the novels are about things that people like Churchill and Leslie Stephen thought they leave out. The French Revolution, there are references to slavery, the empire, patriarchy, and the rights of women. Um, the Perhaps we picked this novel with pretty right on with the timing because the concept of the empire is, if you're reading any of the news or seeing any of the news on TV, it's all about the monarchy. And there was an article, I forget where I saw it was probably on MSN, about people who are protesting the continuation of the monarchy because of the expense, and perhaps they don't do a whole lot, and the like. So the novel seems to be underscoring those same themes. Those subjects might not be in the foreground, but that's because were not inside the English gentry's bubble. The slave trade was not something that ladies and gentlemen talked about, particularly if they had some financial connection to it, as several of Austen's characters seem to. There are plenty of hints in the books about what is going on in the larger world. So you have to pay attention to the hints about what's going on in the larger world. They are not going to be discussed openly. So there's a book entitled Jane Austen, Writing, Society, and Politics. And this is written by this author, was very clear to say. Um, this author, Tom Keemer, who teaches at the University of Toronto, so therefore he is in the professor category, explains that Austen was a novelist in whom an implicitly Tory worldview is frequently interrogated or disrupted by destabilizing ironies and interruptions of satirical anger that are no less real for the elegance and wit of their expression. So this author is saying that Austen questions the Tory point of view. Tories were the conservatives' traditional point of view. Those, of course, that's what you would expect from this little landed gentry community, family, and just these, and the rector, and just these narrow focus of people. But Austen questions by destabilizing ironies and interruptions of satirical anger. Now, maybe you haven't seen any of the anger, but there's satire in this novel. Can you hear the sirens? I swear I can't even get a break about not being interrupted this morning. It asks us, let's see, the literature professors love the notion of texts interrogating things. But in this case, it feels like fence straddling. Another really good image. It asks us to accept an Austen who has somehow simultaneously conservative as a person and subversive as a writer. So that's an interesting dichotomy, because that's the community from where she has come, But in her writing, she questions those things. Austen lived, after all, in an age of revolutions. And Kelly, there's another author named Helena Kelly, and she wrote a book, Jane Austen, The Secret Radical, which was published in 2016. Kelly thinks that her novels are as revolutionary at their heart as anything that Wollstonecraft or Tom Paine wrote. They just have to be read the right way. So we will be examining not only the plot and the characterization, but the questions they bring forth, ironically, underneath. The right way, that was in quotation marks, means treating the brief glimpses Austen gives us of life outside her character's social circles as pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, reveals what is really going on. Kelly makes a case, for example, that passing references to Emma, to can't tell you that. Be careful. But pay attention to ditches and hedges and the fencing off of things. I can tell you this. At the time in England, this is set at the time it was pretty much written, which was 1812, 1813. The concept of fencing off one's property was a debate, because there had been a concept that was widely accepted of the rights of the common. whereby commoners were able to walk onto one's property. And yeah, this was the right to enter, the rights of common, were the rights to enter private land for specified purposes, such as grazing, fishing, foraging, gathering firewood. For many people in rural England, it helped make help make ends meet. Too many ends. Which is very interesting because um, this was a debate that was going on at the time, and we are going to see this we're going to see it in the novel. I'm not even going to tell you where. Kelly cites the scholar Ruth Perry as calculating that access to private lands, as virtually all lands in England were, essentially doubled the income of farming families. So one sat on one's gigantic piece of property, but allowed grazing and foraging, and one would think that that would contribute to the upkeep of the property anyway. As you all know, people use, not so much here in Cedarburg, but elsewhere, use animals to forage to trim the lawn. I saw that at George Washington's estate in Washington, D.C. They use sheep. If any of you live in Mequon, at the beginning of the summer, um, local farmers bring in sheep and goats to eat up all of the invasive species. They fence them into a huge swath of parks. I think it's Rotary where they bring them. And then they let the animals forage,